Dave Talbott is the founder and director of the Thunderbolts project. His roots in the catastrophist movement reach back to the 60s, but it was his book, The Saturn Myth from 1980, which helped inspire the work of several others now joined in the collaborative endeavor. He is co-author with Wal Thornhill of The Electric Universe, the book. His work is the subject of a riveting DVD series, Symbols of an Alien Sky. 2 episodes have been published so far. We shall be seeing parts of the episode on Mars tomorrow evening, and highly recommend that you be present. I think it should be apparent to all that this conference, The Human Story, could never have taken place without his inspiration and tireless effort, not to mention his extraordinary ability to galvanize those around him, so that to be delegated responsibility by Dave sounds like a fun and worthwhile thing. Dave is a muse-in-chief for this movement. His gentle manner and style, combined with a steely passion for the truth, is an inspiration to us all and to a new public. Here with a talk intriguingly titled, Seeking the Third Story, is Dave Talbott.
I've had the interesting experience of mentioning to several people that I'm going to be talking on this subject, and more often than not, someone would respond, well, I want to see that talk, which I find humorous because, well, I haven't told you anything about it yet. And as it turns out, they do seem to have a sense as to what this means, that there really is something wrong with our cultural and scientific environment today, and there is a growing yearning for a deeper understanding, a deeper and more clear and more coherent and unified and non-contradictory and non-fragmented way of seeing the universe. Now, it happened today, as it happens so often, that the first question is, who cares? And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that from folks, because a person with a reporter's eye to a story, for example, will always be thinking in those terms. And it doesn't necessarily register. It may actually, on the first words that are used to express the meaning of the electric universe, it can seem rather remote. But if a person is intellectually alive and has any attention span, let's say, the electric universe is going to meet that person at a level of very deep interest. A lot of the intrigue with respect to what is going on in this group is related to the experience of meaning and inspiration out of what is being learned here. And that comes clearly from the sense that the truth is somehow shining through. Truth, something enduring, something lasting, something that could affect us very deeply. Now, I'm going to show you a brief clip from a future episode of Symbols of an Alien Sky. How did human history begin? The evidence may seem too complex for generalization, yet all of history can be stated as just 2 stories. First came the story of mythology, filled with cosmic dramas and celestial wonders. We lived in the presence of the gods. It was the gods who determined the fate of the world, demanding allegiance, even as they called humans to sacrifice. The gods were unpredictable. When angry, they went to war, or they destroyed their own creation. Over time, however, man's quest for deeper meaning in the myths ignited sparks of spiritual awakening. And it was from these sparks that the great religions arose. But all of the world's religions shared a taproot in mythology. And not one freed itself entirely from the momentum of the first story. The second story arose from doubt, as philosophers, poets, and naturalists began to lose faith in the myths, and some stopped believing in the gods altogether. That was because direct experience under a familiar and highly predictable sky gave no support to the archaic myths. Skepticism inspired closer attention to nature, the essential requirement for the rise of science and technology that would change the world. Thus, the heroic completion of the second story. Rational science rising to vanquish myth and magic. And so the full sweep of human history comes down to just two stories in competition. A cliché, science versus myth and religion. Well into the 20th century, it seemed that we were forced to choose. But a few have wondered, could the myths harbor a truth that we have missed? Something yet to be discovered. A message for science, hidden in the myths and symbols of deepest antiquity. The point I want to make is that seeking a third story requires us to reconsider two stories that dominated human imagination across the whole sweep of human history. Two stories. Now, it was my role to investigate the origins of myth. And to pursue that subject, I had to come to grips with an unexplained mystery. What was the mythic age of gods and wonders remembered around the world? Every culture said the same thing. The gods ruled for a time, then they went away. This age of gods and wonders is punctuated by disaster. And in the end, the gods pass away. Or perhaps they're translated into remote stars or planets. Is that just imagination from one culture to another, unrelated to anything actually experienced? I had the benefit of having been inspired originally by Immanuel Velikovsky. And Velikovsky was an exceptionally controversial figure. Probably in the history of 20th century science, he was up toward the top in the controversial quality of his work. Now, he registered a very broad hypothesis about human history, but it had certain key elements that are very relevant today. The first is that the planetary system was unstable within human memory. He said that in dynamic interactions between planets, electric arcs flew between these bodies and affecting the surfaces of those planets. And he insisted that human memories count as evidence. And planetary instability and human memories counting as evidence both disqualified him from consideration by the scientific community. I happened to be publishing a student journal called Ponce in '72, and I had this sense from our conversations with Immanuel Velikovsky that this was actually a historic juncture. So as I was envisioning how we might treat the issue of Velikovsky, we eventually came to the idea of putting out a special issue of our student journal distributed free on Oregon campuses, and that this could kind of cut across the political divisions and so on that we ourselves were fostering with the kind of material that we were putting out. And that was Immanuel Velikovsky Reconsidered. And from that moment on, my own world just changed completely. One issue grew into 10, and this series had a remarkable impact around the world. It provoked this whole renewal of interest in Velikovsky in the light of new space age data coming back in the 70s. I followed this question then with an incredible enthusiasm, and for a few years, because of certain things that were arising from my own study, I was actually living off of adrenaline for, I swear, 3 or 4 years, realizing that an entirely different assessment of human history and of evidence is possible. The research method, based first and foremost on cross-cultural points of agreement, something that cannot be ignored. There is a power in diverse cultures insisting on the same thing at a level of very specific detail. Attention to the earliest sources. In other words, the evidence was increasing that there was a primordial experience. Well, of course, whatever has been preserved through the point of cross-cultural agreement, you want to refer it back to the very first expressions of those themes, because there's a natural tendency of evolution over time in the myths to fragment and to distort or to localize the message. There was a point at which I realized that there are hundreds of mythic archetypes or points of agreement, and that they're all connected, and that after the myth-making epoch, there is not a single new archetype. That was an incredible revelation that secured for me the possibility of a unified theory of myth. There must have been something unique and experienced around the world that gave rise to this unified complex of mythic archetypes. In a sense, the monumental construction in antiquity is a witness to something that is simply unknown in human consciousness today. Why were they all looking back to critical junctures in the age of gods and wonders? Every monument that was ever constructed, every temple, every city, always involved a recreation of a primordial event. And that event did not point to anything that we can name in natural experience today. Because Velikovsky had made this seemingly preposterous claim that the planet Venus appeared in the sky as a great comet, I kept my eye out for that particular question all the time. And I can only say, because we want to cover a lot of ground here, that not only I, but all who have seriously investigated this question with the kind of open mind that is displayed here have concluded exactly the same thing. Velikovsky was simply and undeniably correct in saying that the planet Venus was a terrifying, great comet, the parent of comets. In other words, all of the ideas about comets, when they responded with fear to a wispy little comet coming into view, everything that drove them was a result of that primordial experience of the great comet, the mother of comets. You can't pursue the mythic archetypes without beginning to notice that in the naming of planets in relationship to these mythic powers, there is a consistency that has to have an explanation. And there will be no explanation unless the planets were gathered above humanity in a way that has no conceivable explanation in the sky we observe today. So that was the heart of a new way of looking at human history and planetary history. What was the age of gods and wonders? Where did the gods live? The answer to that question is undeniably based on the early sources. They lived in the sky. And why did we stop believing in the gods? For the simple reason that In the course of time, with distance from that primordial experience, there was nothing in the human experience of nature that would lend any support to the myths. All myths became increasingly preposterous. To gain a sense of the coherence and the universality of the myths, it's good to start with some of the absolute fundamentals: the myth of the primeval paradise, the golden age, an age of peace and plenty on earth, harmony in the sky. There probably is not a well-documented culture in an earlier time that failed to remember that tradition. And then there was this catastrophic event that brought the age of the gods to its violent conclusion. And what was the power that appeared in the sky in the intervening phase of history? This dragon-like form. What is most significant about this form is that when you investigate it under the rules of cross-cultural investigation, you find that every ancient hieroglyph within the cultural traditions you're investigating, every symbol is a symbol of the comet. Long flowing hair, long flowing beard, long flowing feathers, serpentine form, fiery countenance, fiery breath, all symbols of the comet. Don't believe in accidents. That's the heart of this research method. Convergence on extraordinary detail has to mean shared experience, even if we have not understood it. I can thank Velikovsky, and quite frankly, a brief outline I saw from Bill Mullen way back in 1972. It was like a page and a half outline of Velikovsky's idea about the planet Saturn. It was not in Worlds in Collision. He had pulled it from Worlds in Collision in order to present a more complete hypothesis. But that was so intriguing, this idea that Saturn had this extraordinary role in the earliest remembered time. And so I followed that. And yes, Saturn was directly tied to the Golden Age, as you can see in this quote about life in the time of Kronos, when he ruled in heaven, Kronos being the Greek name of the planet Saturn. Follow the threads, and everything you encounter just expands the anomaly, expands the sense of something out of our familiar experience that was so much on the mind of the ancients. Today, probably not 1 in 1,000 people know that Helios, the Greek word for the sun, was in an early time the name of the planet Saturn. Sol was a name of the planet Saturn. Shamash, the Babylonian sun god, was explicitly identified with the planet Saturn. Scholars that investigate this never dispute it, but why that would be so is disputed. There is an idea of a great conjunction that has nothing to do with what we call a conjunction or even a great conjunction today. We see the planets gathering within a 30-degree arc of the sky, and we call that a great conjunction. No, the principle that is inherent, that you see at the heart of the ancient myths, is the planet stood in one line, such that that line ran right through the heart of those gathered bodies. Now, why would anyone say that that was the condition that prevailed in the first chapter of the Age of Gods and Wonders? And that's what we'll see. I'll discuss this at length in my presentation on Sunday. Every culture in antiquity tended to have a line of kings, and they could trace that line of kings back to a mythic first king. And this is where you find the preeminence of the planet Saturn as the first father, the father of kings. What would that mean, and why would that memory have so preoccupied those who formulated the rights of kingship, declaring that the blood of that first ancestor courses through the veins of our king? And what was the connection to the myth of heaven close to the earth? The entire idea as a universal theme, as a mythic archetype, makes no sense. But there's an intimate connection to Saturn. It has to be explained because you have a father figure and a younger version of the same figure, and that has to be unraveled. But the truth is that the myth of heaven, when heaven was close to the earth, is inseparably connected to the planet Saturn for no apparent reason at all. So I actually got Doubleday very excited about a book before I had written it, just on the basis of an article I had written and an outline. And I think that they had expectations for the book that left them sorely disappointed after it was published. The sales were simply not impressive. And yet, there is today a group of people who were inspired by the book. It was effective with those who really paid attention. One, incidentally, is Ev Cochran, whom a number of you people know, and he is now a world-class expert on world mythology. There was this forgotten epoch, and what was seen in the sky bore no resemblance to things we see now. And humans on Earth drew pictures of these forms, of dynamically evolving configuration in the sky, pressing in on the Earth, obsessively preoccupying human beings. Out of respect for time, I'm not going to belabor the details, but just leave with you the sense of some underlying pattern. And as Bill Mullen said, it is this ability to recognize patterns, as is being done within our group as a whole, that means everything. Pattern recognition leading the way. And in every instance, you're looking at patterns that are archetypal, and every archetype is a defiance of nature as we experience it today. There is a wheel-like character to this form, and it provoked this explanation, going back many years, that they must have been drawing pictures of the sun and imagined that the sun was a wheel rolling across the sky. And yet the truth is that these pictographs, in countless numbers, precede the discovery of useful applications of the wheel. And it is very evident, in fact, that the discovery of useful applications was connected to models turned on temple walls, and in one way or another as a praying wheel or whatever it might be. There's kind of an example of it here in the wheel of Shamash, where the wheel is turned on a rope. The useful wheel emerged from the sacred wheel. It's not the reverse. And notice that the spokes of the wheel are not functional anyway. They're etheric. And Shamash is the planet Saturn, say the magical texts of Assyria and Babylonia. So honestly, folks, does the sun in our sky look like this? Okay, here we go to a brief segment of the first episode of Symbols of an Alien Sky. You're looking at reconstructed images of a formation in the heavens just a few thousand years ago. The configuration evolved through many phases, evoking reverence and awe, a model for kings and kingdoms for thousands of years. Great temples and cities and sacred mountains all pointed back to the mythic age of gods and wonders. Let the world's first astronomers point the way for us. They knew that what the myths and hymns and prayers called gods were planets and aspects of planets. Planets appeared close to the earth in a heaven-spanning configuration. Memories of that celestial splendor still surround us, even if humanity later forgot much more than it remembered. Reconnecting with our forgotten past will be essential for our own cultural integrity, essential for the study of human consciousness, and essential for all of the sciences. Here is the fulcrum of a reconstruction, stylized, but it carries the whole message that I want to leave with folks tonight. It's a claim that I will swear by, and yet it could only sound preposterous to someone who hasn't investigated this. The story of mythology is the story of what happened to these bodies, and there is no other story. That really is true. And anyone who follows the rules of the investigation will discover this for themselves. It's happening right now. Maybe when we get to the panel discussions at the encore event, we'll have some substantial discussion of the human story, and we may talk about exactly what this means. The point here is this configuration that is at the center of a reconstruction is the culmination of an evolutionary phase that preceded it, through which the participants were progressively clarified, a clarification of the personalities of the male and female powers, the female power being the great star in the center of the overarching sphere. A smaller star, a smaller planet, a darker, redder sphere, was the prototype of the warrior hero. The starburst form was the prototype of the mother goddess, the great star, the great comet, before it was removed to become the angry goddess. So there's just this sweeping story. It's not going to be told briefly, because the configuration evolved through dynamic and at times violent phases. But the point here is it can be reconstructed, because people were drawing pictures, carving pictures on stone of what was seen. And today we have this incredible benefit that the pictures that are recorded on stone can actually be evaluated under laboratory examination of electric discharge in a plasma environment. And I should mention, because this form is so unusual, I always laughed when I would step back and consider the symmetry of the configuration that I'd reconstructed. I was calling this dust, gas and dust, in the emptiness of space. Why would it gather into symmetries? And everything I was reconstructing involved various layers and symmetries that seemed utterly preposterous. And then Walt Thornhill arrived in my office in late 96, early 97, and he explained to me that in electric discharge in a plasma, you get this kind of symmetry, and he illustrated it for me. Walt Thornhill. So that was the beginning of a collaboration that won't quit now. We've published 2 books, and the theme is a convergence of myth and science. One of those books, The Thunderbolts of the Gods, takes advantage of a fact that the cosmic thunderbolt in the antique world provides us with a bridge between myth and science. And every fact that you can bring forth relating to this cosmic thunderbolt is explicit and extraordinary and anomalous. The warrior god's weapon was not inspired by any practical function, and of course it never looks like lightning. But imagine a warrior launching an arrow with the configuration seen here, which would make the arrow effectively dysfunctional. But it is a familiar form to those who know electric discharge in plasma. The Syrian form, there are many variants, and it's quite clear that whatever was being experienced, it did go through an extraordinary evolution in the sky. Not everyone understands this, but the scholars who've looked certainly do understand that the tridents of early myth and symbolism were forms of the cosmic thunderbolt. And now you know why we chose that image of this conference, the ancient image of the cosmic thunderbolt, the Sanskrit Vajra, Tibetan Dorje, the Japanese Kongo. The weapon of the warrior god Indra and of so many others, the identity of that warrior god himself. In instance after instance, he is his weapon. Thunderbolt of Odin, this bipolar form is continually recurring. Look at the heart of this figure. The heart of heaven, the innermost heart of that configuration that we initially showed, was the form of the cosmic thunderbolt in its first phases of evolution. And that sphere that is identified here as the masculine seed is such a recurring element. It just must be a part of whatever dynamic sequence is being displayed in the ancient images of the thunderbolt. A few Greek examples. And the point to follow is that while artists progressively elaborated the thunderbolt form, it became increasingly complex. There's an underlying form that stands out and must be investigated in relation to plasma discharge. In terms of the evolving ways of artistically representing the cosmic thunderbolt, because it was evolving in the sky, an extremely common practice was to juxtapose various phases in the evolution of that form. And that's what you're seeing here. There are 4, 5, or 6 different elements of the cosmic thunderbolt in its evolutionary sequence that are displayed here. Fact, the prototype of the warrior god's sword or arrow was a thunderbolt. Now you have no doubt assumed that the great warrior gods of all of the folk literature and so on, with their magical weapons, they never missed their mark or they returned to the hand of the warrior himself, that these were just based on our experience of warriors with weapons. It's quite to the contrary. The original form of the warrior's weapon was the cosmic thunderbolt. Now there was a time after I had converged with Wall and I had realized that the thunderbolt, it had to be at the center of the whole story of violence in the sky. I thought that I was the only one on earth that could have possibly known, because it's such a preposterous idea, that all of these weapons of great warrior gods were actually the cosmic thunderbolt. I mean, that's a ludicrous idea. These stories of great heroes are claimed to have emerged from our experience in an earlier time of conflict and battles on great battlefields and so on. But I found I was not the first by any means. When the sacrificer brandishes the wooden sword, it is the thunderbolt that he hurls at the enemy. The sword is derived from a lightning flash archetype, of which it is the descendant. And this is why you find the word for lightning in so many of the ancient words for different heroic swords. A derivation of the sword and similarly of the Celt from a root or archetype in lightning is universal and worldwide. In other words, that takes it right into the realm of the archetypes, the points of agreement. In the matter of prehistoric weapons, in every country without exception, they are always thunderbolts and never anything else. Renee went on. Now, I think most of you understand that the investigation now is bringing together the myths and symbols and experiments in the laboratory that show bridges that had never entered human imagination previously. Laboratory discharge. knots, toroids, and wings emerge in plasma instabilities. I think this is a discharge form from the Princeton Plasma Lab illustrating or emphasizing that instabilities produce axial columns and embedded cylinders. Embedded cylinders. This becomes an extremely important consideration. An illustration of laboratory, high energy discharge in a plasma medium. The beginning with the knot flattening into a torus, the torus folding upwards into the beginnings of a kind of champagne glass, wine glass form, as another torus is forming. Back, just to illustrate, you can see it again in that particular image. A more angular look can be acquired. Embedded cylinders and pinching of the cylinders at the plasma pinch point, which is key to the evolution of that configuration. The Vajra. Yes, artistic elaboration has occurred. I mean, this would be at least 1,000 or 2,000 years after the actual experience, and that's part of the evolution of myth and symbolism over time. But you see everything still in the design element that is inherent in the electric discharge in the plasma laboratory. The form in the hand of Zeus is in that early phase where it's beginning to send out the petals. I like this image. The red-headed warrior is telling because, I mean, one of the first things that begins to register when you're examining warriors identified with the planet Mars is the red form. But notice his head is surmounted by the upper termination of the cosmic thunderbolt. The warrior is his weapon. Greek images showing that evolution in various stylized forms. And the kind of complexity you see here is actually representative of the complexities that will appear in varying conditions in electric discharge. But surely no one needs to emphasize that we've never seen lightning take this form. So what is being underscored here is the absolute contradiction of the mythic archetypes to the natural experience. Only intense electric discharge in a plasma can create these forms. One step forward. More than 10,000 years ago, Paleolithic artists painted these images on the walls of Lascaux Cave in France. They were realists, with an exceptional eye for detail. Why these talented artists of the Stone Age disappeared remains a mystery. But the greater mystery is the epoch that followed. It seems that Neolithic artists lost the ability to depict nature as we know it. Accurate representations of nature are present, but the dominant style produced a carnival of ghostly creatures and absurd forms never seen in our world. How did this tendency arise? Not in one land alone, but on every habitable continent. Absurd, yes, but what provoked the distinctive patterns? A stick man with no head, just a duck or other bird on his shoulders? Hundreds of variations on this theme occur in the American Southwest. But the pattern doesn't end there. Notice the twin dots on the two sides of these crudely crafted stick figures. One instance alone is just a curiosity. But widespread patterns must have an explanation. And other details only accent the irrationality. Recently, an answer to these mysteries came from outside traditional archaeology, from plasma science and laboratory experiments with electric discharge. Plasma scientist Anthony Peratt of Los Alamos Laboratories has shown that these stick forms recorded electrical events in the sky. Something like the northern lights we see today, but 1,000 times more energetic. And he matches the rock art forms precisely to the configurations taken by electric discharge in the laboratory. The rock art images are explained as sheets of intense electric current in the evolution of a plasma discharge. The central column you see in this stylized representation is the axis of the discharge. Wrapped around the axis is a torus or donut-like tubular sheet of charged particles. The observer sees through the transparent formation, champagne glass above, squashed bell shape below, so the plasma density is greatest at the limbs. Drawn in 2 dimensions, the formation matches the stick man carved globally on stone by the thousands. The 2 dots under the stick man's arms are the exceedingly bright, high-energy radiation called synchrotron radiation, emitted from the center of the torus. The current sheets continually warp as the electric discharge progresses, and this form is not uncommon. A 2-dimensional representation might look like this. Peratt's work has shown that the stickman, the duck-headed version of the American Southwest, and variations from Hawaii to Saudi Arabia, is a plasma discharge formation, a subject on which he is an acknowledged world expert. Peratt's investigation is entirely independent from our own. Thousands of rock art images have enabled a supercomputer to identify formations as seen from different positions on Earth. The fit that he has documented cannot be accidental. And yet our own investigation, which preceded Peratt's by almost 3 decades, converges with his in extraordinary ways, as I shall clarify in the 2nd episode of this series. For scholars and scientists as a whole, rock art remains an unsolved mystery. For 200 years, experts have debated over the vast library of images on stone. Definitive considerations are now in hand, calling for a new perspective, one that follows the compelling evidence for high-energy electrical events in the ancient sky. And those who pursue this line of investigation must not be afraid to ask how the movements of planets may have contributed to an electrified cosmic environment, of which science knew nothing only a few decades ago. Now, because we've just introduced the work of Tony Peratt, and I'm sure many of you know that it doesn't stop here. The convergence with Peratt has actually a very interesting history, and I'm just going to address that briefly so as to not get stopped at this point. But Tony became a very good friend, traveling to Portland more than once. I traveled to Albuquerque and Santa Fe more than once, and we got together for dinners, and he was incredibly animated, but I was essentially precluded at that time from mentioning any association at all. now, with the passage of time, it is, I think, only appropriate to be pretty explicit, as I've been over just the past 3 years or so, about the nature of that relationship, how it evolved, and what it actually means. I was in 2000 working with Rick Smith of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, database manager, and conveying to Rick ideas about a more complex dimension of an evolving configuration that required us to look at it three-dimensionally. And three-dimensional representation was becoming increasingly important because I was beginning to see that we were observing configurations in a phase of, you might call it, cosmic wandering. And in the myths, it was the phase of wandering gods. And so Rick produced an image that I then translated into an illustration of what I had been calling the chain of arrows. Now, when Wall came to Portland in September of 2000, ahead of a symposium to which we had invited Tony Peratt, I showed the image to Wall of the chain of arrows form. I asked him, Wall, how did plasma do this? And Wall said, well, it is so clear that it is a plasma discharge form, but it needs to be investigated more completely. And then Tony Peratt arrived at the conference, and in a private gathering of speakers, I'm trusting you can see that image up in the upper left, he just drew out a form, and he called it the Christmas tree. I said, Tony, you've just drawn the chain of arrows. It's a very dominant form in laboratory discharge experiments. It was named after Tony Peratt, a Peratt instability. His team members honored him with that title. I said that to Tony, and he responded, well, how does it evolve? And I'm not going to discuss the evolution here, but I will allude to it in my talk on Sunday. But essentially, it was twin filaments spiraling up the axis of the Earth, dividing into a stack of toruses that took the appearance of a chain of arrows, and then as a ladder of heaven, the backbone of the sky. This is such an exotic concept, and yet it can be reconstructed in very finite detail, and it is simply inconceivable to me that something other than the actual human experience could possibly account for the accord, which is global. So Tony asked me, when he got back home, he said, send me the rock art. And for starters, though I have thousands of rock art images, I sent him just one. And it was entirely on the basis of intuition. I had come to believe that this was one of the purest representations of that discharge form. And as Tony recounts it, the moment he saw this, he knew that his life was changed. His initial response was fear that somebody had somehow hacked into his computer and diagnosed the plasma discharge forms. A lot of this stuff back then, before Tony got it declassified, was really top secret information. This form, just given a little bit of three-dimensionality on the right so you can see it is three-dimensional. And so you have that wine glass form on top, and you have that toroidal form at the base, and you have a stack of toruses where the disc has folded sharply upward. And that's what does happen. And the stack of toruses, Tony confirmed to me, is absolutely and unequivocally a dominant feature of the evolving configuration in the laboratory. And there is something quite meaningful in this phase. It's not as popularly inscribed on stone for one reason in particular, that it is highly energetic and violent and potentially deadly in its radiation. And it collapses into this form, which is the stickman form. And at the time that I learned this from Tony, I had never imagined that there was an explanation that I could understand of the stickman form. And he provided it.
Of course, we now know that the geometries of electric discharge in plasma are abundantly evident in space.
And look at the core of the most energetic emanation, how beautifully symmetrical it is. And that is a pointer back to the kind of symmetries, bipolar symmetries, that were evident in the ancient sky. Now, people are going to get bored with this image fairly soon. I think this is the third time tonight. But it's such a beautiful bipolar form. And not all the forms exhibit that spectacular symmetry, because conditions in the sky would be wildly varying within the Milky Way. But this bipolar form is so clearly analogical to the Thunderbolt form. Really quite spectacular, quite beautiful, but certainly not driven by gravity. Now I'm just going to give an overview of directions for finding a third story, because our minds must be willing to work with a reconsideration of the first story and the second story, and we must come to fully appreciate the fact that the first story will never be understood in the absence of the electric universe, and the second story must be rewritten in the light of the electric universe. So this is the basis of the incredible sense of a unified possibility that is emerging now within this group. Now that we are seeing space across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, it is becoming undeniable that things are occurring out in space, that exotic structures are being seen that were simply never anticipated, but are observed in the laboratory. Electricity, the unifying force. And as we've discussed, what in our cosmic neighborhood would be the best window to the electric universe? It seems increasingly clear, because the sun is the most thoroughly investigated body in our solar system, outside the Earth itself, that if we live in an electric universe, there is a fundamental misunderstanding that must be corrected. Our electric sun. And then down to the smallest level, into the quantum domain, surely the underpinnings of the natural world, seen in terms of the role of the electric force, as Wall and many others who are gathered here today have begun to explain. That is key. The electricity of life, the people who are here to address that subject now, they are on the cutting edge. It is both the ancient myths and symbols and the modern perception of planetary history that must come together in one analysis. The goddess image in much of our culture today is very, very popular, but one thing I came to notice is that it's popular and there's almost a kind of reverence for that goddess form. But in all of the visionary art and the exotic representations of that mythic theme, it seemed as if there was nothing actually underpinning it. It was just floating. And in the final analysis, it is our role to bring clarity to visionary art, because the archetypes could not be meaningless. And we can agree with them on that, but we can bring the roots beneath those archetypes so that they can begin to be interpreted in a way that will be, well, simply more meaningful. the cosmic warrior. Why is it that amongst all of the planets around the world, the astronomical traditions always identify the planet of the mother goddess as Venus, and always, when looking out at Mars, they unanimously agree that was a great warrior? Don't believe in accidents. What we're all talking about here is the power of convergence. I enjoyed very much Greg Bolt's exposition on that. Convergence, not artificial consensus. Meaningful peer review. We all want that, but not peer review that is just a gatekeeping device. We want those who are open-minded and fully accredited to become the vehicle for assessing extraordinary new ideas, and not to be dismissed or fired because they gave their approval to an extraordinary idea. And if anyone here doesn't believe that there's that kind of fear active under the present peer review system and the institutionalization of science, well, you're dead wrong. We see this all the time. There are people here I happen to know are anonymous today because of the power of that force. Pattern recognition, as Dr. Mullen was just emphasizing earlier, it's a key. It's leading the way. It's opening the doors to possibilities. You don't start with mathematics. You get the interdisciplinary picture by seeing patterns and understanding what is going on at a practical common sense level, and you direct the mathematicians to begin working with these patterns which are telling us something is fundamentally wrong. Don't just keep elaborating a previous idea mathematically to make things work. And that means we need a broader field of view. This is what I love about the NPA. They know what natural science is. If you're always looking an inch wide and a mile deep, how well are you able to see the evidence shouting at you from the broader horizon of your science? It's telling you that your focus is too narrow and you're missing the things that actually falsify your assumption. And I don't think anybody in this room needs to be told that the role of the scientific maverick is absolutely essential today, and we are here to support that role. And it is why we came into an alignment with the Natural Philosophy Alliance. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you, sir.